I'm Will Milberg, Director of the Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School for Social Research, and I'm here with some colleagues to discuss a special issue that we just produced that was published a couple of weeks ago on really the issue of the day, which is Challenges of Democracy and the Future of Capitalism, published in Social Research, fall 2024, and available on the website of the Heilbronner Center. I'm very keen to hear everyone's views today because, of course, the issues that we discussed in this journal at a sometimes theoretical, sometimes empirical, sometimes historical level, very much are at the core of what we're experiencing today in the US political culture. The economy has been a force that has propelled the Trump into power, the Trump administration to power. Uh, Despite economic policy contributions of the Biden administration that may have been positive, the economic implications of a second Trump administration, of course, may be very far reaching. So, to discuss this issue, we have four colleagues who each contributed to the special issue, and they will address questions of the relation between democracy and economy, and of course, can reflect on how their research agenda also relates to the moment. Mariana Mazzucato, Professor of Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, will start off. Teresa Ghilarducci is the Bernard Schwartz Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research. Hans Kundnani, a fellow at New York University's Remark Institute, and Mark Setterfield, the Leo Model Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research. And Mariana, would you get us started?
Sure. And what a wonderful group. I got my PhD at the New School, and I still consider it my home intellectually and for all sorts of other reasons, but also because of the battle that we have in front of us. There is a real battle to make capitalism work for people and planet. And what I tried to do in the issue was to step back and also reflect on why is it that we're so stuck with policies that might sound good, even those that are about inclusive growth and sustainable growth, but don't land in such a way, Will, exactly as you said, that makes sense to people. Look at the IRA, sure, actually great numbers in terms of even what it's catalyzed in private sector investment and new jobs. But if it's not framed, and I'm definitely not blaming the IRA, but I'll get to that in a minute. If it's not framed in such a way that actually resonates with the actual problems that people are facing every day, um, then it's really hard for it to also contribute to the narrative that we need and the complete kind of transformation of the economic trajectory that we currently have. So what I addressed in the issue was, in the special issue, was this need to reformulate, for example, industrial policies, which have been revived. It's no longer blasphemy to talk about industrial policy, but to reformulate them that really have the lives of people at the center. In other words, this idea of having a challenge/mission-oriented policy that focuses on the problems, whether it's solving hunger in Brazil, whether it's actually having cities that can be healthy, just, and sustainable, but with really practical goals for those cities around net zero, but in such a way that also involve people in that process of even negotiating what does it mean to talk about a sustainable city. If we can focus on the goals and then ask ourselves, what does it mean for all the different sectors in an economy? What does it mean for the redesign of the tools themselves? Think of procurement policy, which is often 30% of a government's budget. It's often just wasted, right? It's just like contracting to do low cost stuff. Imagine if we procured in school meals that have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable as part of a greater agenda of making sure that everyone in the United States has 3 healthy, accessible meals a day. What does that mean for the different way that governments see their role in the actual tools that they have on the ground, as opposed to coming up with kind of big policies that sound great, that might even catalyze some investment, but then that don't resonate? And so that idea of a mission-oriented policy that again focuses on biodiversity goals, on climate goals, on health-related goals, but gets grounded in such a way that people understand and have had opportunity to participate in the design of those very missions is something I really believe in. And I think it really resonates today with many countries where the rise of populism, I look at Italy, I have three citizenships, one of which is in the US, one of which is in Italy. And in Italy, definitely the rise of the extreme right, the current government that we have in power is on the back of about 20 years of austerity that we had in Europe, where many working people just have really felt disenfranchised, left behind, and unfortunately then, find quite appealing these political parties that come in and prefer just to blame the African immigrants or the left that failed in every way. And we end up, of course, with much bigger problems from that populist politics. But we shouldn't think that they were stupid to vote that way. If people have been, again, disenfranchised, left behind, if their own lives aren't changing in the everyday way, even though we have these progressive policies, then it's not surprising that that it just doesn't land, and then we get these elections, which unfortunately, make things much worse.
Fascinating.
I was going to go on, but it's
no, stop, and hopefully, if everyone can be as brief as you were and as substantive, we'll have a great conversation following another round. So, Teresa, could we turn to you?
Yes. The issue of economic security and downward mobility in economic security was an issue of the last couple of presidential elections, and it really was emphasized in this election. When you looked county by county, which my paper does, and look at how those county votes went, we'll find out what people did, but we now just look at areas. You find places that agreed with Biden and also agree with Trump. There are fundamental similarities between the Trump and Biden agendas. Both of them reject free trade and neoliberalism, free flow of capital, free flow of labor, wide open borders for capital and also for people were rejected with Biden. Biden had a big swerve away from the Obama Clinton dominant Democratic agenda and said, you need protection. And they used, lots of academics were right behind them with lots of NBER papers. So these are high profile elite academic papers that showed that the China shock really affected the left behind counties. I'm echoing Mark's paper in the journal talking about the left behinds. And I'm going to be spending the next couple of weeks really combing county by county and then census tract by census tract. And I hypothesize I am going to find a great support for Biden plus that actually Trump offered. Trump offered even more tariffs, even more protection, even more empathy for everybody left behind, the white working class and the women that accompany them, and also to the group of minorities that is bigger than Black Americans, which are Latinos. So I'll end now to say in Reading, Pennsylvania, where many Latino migrants are from Puerto Rico, there was a thought that they would sort of attach their national pride or their ethnic identity to the Harris campaign and just sort of leave behind and ignore the economic promises that Trump made. And we saw that the Latino vote was quite engaged and went heavily for Trump. So I think his message, that's my hypothesis now, of economic security and actually oddly empathy for people who have lacked economic security won the day. And it wasn't just a peculiar election where if you flip the coin, it would have gone the other way like 2016. It was a resounding vote for his economic policies of protection, and they weren't that much different than Biden's.
Thank you, Teresa, putting the economics right at the forefront. Hans, can we turn to you now?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm very struck by how, these two issues of democracy and the economy have been sort of at the core of the whole election. And obviously this is the relationship between those two questions is precisely what the whole special issue is about. Our paper, Will, the paper that we co-authored together, looks at this specific question of whether Bidenomics was going to be enough to save democracy, as it were. This is very much the way that the Biden campaign, when Biden was still the candidate, had framed it. That I'm the only person essentially that stands between the US and the end of democracy. Obviously, when Harris took over, I think that narrative continued, especially in the last, I think, couple of weeks of the election, where she really doubled down, I think, on the democracy questions. And essentially what we argued in our piece is that that we wanted to basically separate out these questions of, a Biden victory and the state of democracy in America, because we basically argue that they're two different things, and getting Biden elected was not the same as saving democracy, even though that was the way that the Biden campaign was framing it. And so we argue that even if Biden had managed, through Bidenomics, targeting left behind communities and so on, he might be able to get re-elected, and Harris, obviously the same thing. But that wouldn't quite mean saving democracy in America. That in order to save democracy, you would have to do a whole bunch of other things. Now, obviously, the way things have panned out has been slightly different, but I think our argument is still kind of relevant because, what I'm very struck by is how, at least according to the exit polls, the key issue for Democrats was democracy, and the key issue for Republicans was the economy. And we don't quite yet have the data, but my hunch is that actually the decisive group that shifted, those swing voters, did so because they were prioritizing the economy over these questions around democracy. They didn't buy the arguments that the Biden campaign was making, and they thought, rightly or wrongly, and this is something just anecdotally that I've heard again and again, including, by the way, from non-white voters, which is one of the big issues in the election yesterday, that they just simply felt that the economy was better under Trump, and worse under Biden, and it would be worse under Harris. Now, that then becomes an issue not so much about whether the economy was really better, but about the perception of the economy. But nevertheless, it does strike me this morning that, in a funny way, I think, and this is very much contrary to the idea that people vote for Trump for these cultural reasons. I sort of have the feeling this morning that in a funny way, we're back to the sort of Clinton era, it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
Thank you. This has gone in a direction I didn't expect. Mark, we turn to you.
Well, I think I'm going to give you more of the same, Will. My perspective is informed by the sense that I think the economy and civil society have been in a vicious circle for over 40 years now. And I think that dynamic has become more acute over the last 15 years. We have an entrenched economic system, call it neoliberalism or whatever you like, that is a model of exclusive development. And the question that it then confronts is how, in a democratic society, do you manufacture mass consent for a system that is, at its core, exclusive? And the idea that was put forward over 30 years ago was what you need to do is manage the discontent of the losers. I think that's a broad project. It has in the past included things like household debt accumulation that have created the mirage of economic inclusion. But it is a mirage because, of course, the process is unsustainable. And I think what we're left with now is, to the detriment of civil society, is the sort of rump end of that managing the discontent of the losers project, which involves going ever deeper into what I call in my contribution to the special issue, divisive consensus building, where you channel the sense of exclusion, of being left behind, essentially the righteous sense of grievance at the economic development patterns of the last 40-odd years, into a sort of tyranny of the majority against Black people, against immigrants. I think we've even learned that to a large extent you can channel misogyny, despite the fact that women are about 50% of the population, to your advantage in this process of building a social coalition that is illiberal in order to prop up an economic system that is neoliberal, and really more fundamentally than that is exclusive, that works really chiefly, if not only, to the advantage of affluent members of society. I think what we need to do is to break that cycle is there needs to be a hard turn back towards social democracy. There needs to be fundamental restructuring of the labor market to end and reverse the disempowerment of labor that is most epitomized by deunionization. We need to recapture the idea of a welfare state. What is it? A series of economic ladders that create economic and social mobility. It's not a system that just gives handouts to lazy sponges. And we need to have serious conversations about international trade and finance, what in popular discourse is called globalization, and move away from the type of globalization that we've witnessed in the WTO era towards types that we have actually witnessed in the past. Trade per se is not the enemy. Any advanced economy needs trade, domestic and international, to thrive. I think, just to sort of bring this home with a comment on the election result, I think our prospects have worsened, not because obviously we're not going to get any of this out of a Trump administration, but my concern is that his sort of cheap populist stunts, appeals to arbitrary and capricious tariffs, for example, are actually going to besmirch the type of progressive project that needs to engage in serious conversation with society at all levels about, for example, international trade and finance. It's actually going to be more difficult in the short term to have that serious conversation, but I am certainly heartened by the fact that all of my colleagues are, as I am myself, I think, on the same page that it is the economy, stupid, in the sense, I think, that what economics can do, isn't doing for society as a whole, is it can create the conditions where civil society doesn't need to be a liberal. It can address the discontent of the losers at its source. It can remove the need to manage that discontent through these increasingly illiberal turns.
Let me turn that to Mariana, which is something that you said really stuck out for me, which was this importance of participation in the design of the mission. And so how the kind of substance of the economic policies that a number of people have weighed in on relates to the process of making law, making policy change as a democratic process. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, also just because I was feeling I don't want to jump in, even though we're all doing our, our 4-minute turns, on this issue that it's, not democracy, but the economy. It's both, right? And how we construct an economy through democratic participation, or if people feel excluded, not just in terms of the lack of economic benefits they're getting, but from the participation itself. They just don't feel like it means anything to them. And I think, so few people in the world talked about the UAW strike that happened last November, a year ago. It was huge, like hugely important. It was the first time that the UAW struck against the 3 companies, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. And why was it important? Because Trump was saying, drill, baby, drill. The green economy is bad for wages, bad for workers. The left, they're crazy. They come up with this climate change stuff, but it's going to screw everyone over. And he's kind of right, unless we fight for a just transition, right? So making sure that the battery workers were being paid as much as, or with good working conditions, as good as the workers in the unionized Ford and GM plants, was a historic victory. Otherwise, electrification, part of a climate, kind of green IRA, which then allows those working in part of the supply chain to have the race to the bottom instead of making the whole thing a race to the top. Not only is that important, but it doesn't happen on its own. There's nothing deterministic about that. It happens if you fight for it, right? I always remind my students the reason we have weekends, the reason we have holidays is because people fought for it. The labor movement fought for that. And it's not just through the labor movement, right? It's also about governance structures. I've been really inspired by some very local work that I've done in cities, transforming food banks, which are alive and well because of inequality, into food cooperatives, green food cooperatives. The people walking into a food bank that feel, ashamed, they shouldn't, but they do, are completely different. Their facial expression, their energy, their sense of value of their life is completely different when they're part of owning, in terms of the governance structure, a food cooperative. The dignity, the value for your own life, right? A lot of the crime we see around the world is when your own body has no value. You've been made to feel that you have no value. It's much easier to kill someone else. And so these issues of how do we bring participation and co-creation and making sure that these transitions, which of course we need a green transition, but if it's an unjust green transition, it's going to lead to populism, the Gilets jaunes in France. And so I just think that's both about democracy and the economy. And the other thing, I mean, this is sort of a funny story. I went to Washington. I've been living now in London for 25 years, but it was in 2018. And I was talking to the usual suspects, or maybe it was 2019, I can't remember, to AOC, to Elizabeth Warren. I was talking to, all the friends that we have over there trying to fight the fight of having a more just and inclusive economy. And then I was called in from Marco Rubio's team, and I always pronounce it like he's an Italian, but however you guys pronounce Marco Rubio. And he was saying very similar things that I just heard 2 seconds before from Elizabeth Warren in terms of 2 things in particular. He had just put out a whole report, his team, on basically saying, hey, China has an entrepreneurial state like Mariana Mazzucato has written about, the US needs one. And they cited the entrepreneurial state, the book I wrote back in 2013, like 10 times. A separate report they wrote about was on this financialized form of corporate governance, which was not helping workers, the share buybacks, the dividend payouts that were not getting reinvested back into the production system was again hurting workers. And for that, they cited my other book, The Value of Everything. So I was sitting there like, oh, this is weird. The Republicans like these books. And I said to him and his team, I was like, so wait, what makes you different from the same thing I just heard, on the Democrats? And the answer was, we believe in family values. And at first I kind of laughed. I was like, oh, like, what do they mean by that? But then actually what they meant was community, right? And of course, we know there's hypocrisy. Forget what we actually think, in terms of the individuals or the party or the election. But the fact that actually you have part of the Republicans trying to go after this problem of a corporate governance structures, which has hurt workers, and the lack, this is pre-Biden, of course, of a proper industrial strategy, which is also going to hurt workers because there won't be any kind of economy to work in without that, was just super interesting. And it didn't lead to a coalition between the Warren camp and the Marco Rubio camp, but it does mean that we really need to go beyond this kind of left-right and go to the core of these issues. And of course, it can get captured and presented in dysfunctional ways. But as Teresa was saying, some of the core issues are the same. And and just lastly, something that Mark said, which I really believe in, it's actually part of a new book I'm writing, bringing together the welfare state and the innovation state, right? Like, how do we create wealth in a different way? How do we put the problems that people face in their everyday life, their well-being and welfare in that sense, but also welfare policies and innovation and industrial policies together, I think is one of the biggest problems of our time. And that does mean, though, again, having empathy and actually talking to the people out there of how their lives are. Otherwise, we're just formulating policies that actually don't not only have the resonance, but aren't then catalyzing that economy-wide, intersectoral and intergovernmental in terms of different ministries kind of collaboration that we need if we're really going to put the way that people feel and live their everyday lives first.
Thank you for that. Yeah,
Just
go ahead.
In 1 minute, because I'm watching
Please.
the clock. I would say, Mariana, that the subtext of family is that they're pro-worker without being pro-union. Because a union coalition has a different kind of collective action and a move towards a social democratic state, especially if it's embedded in community and in the church. And that is a winning combination, and that is what the Democratic Party needs to reflect upon. And second, excited about your new project, something the Clinton campaign actually came to me and really worked on. And their issue was, how do we make social insurance, protection from risk, something that helps a family and an economy grow? Very abstract question, but exactly your question. Because people don't want welfare. In fact, welfare recipients are loath to even use that kind of word. They want social insurance, something that they contributed to, and something that leads to their production. So it's the same argument we need to lift up: guaranteed jobs of last resort, not UBI.
Yeah,
I
and
moved away.
pre-distribution, not
Yeah,
redistribution.
exactly. And
And
really,
redistribution.
and that is actually what a labor movement says, is that everybody deserves to work. Everybody deserves an off-ramp to work when they can't. Everybody belongs. I'll just use the quote from a papal encyclical, because that is part of the organization, as that we're all on the great work bench. And all that work needs to be honored. It's in the labor papal encyclical.
I think one other thing that dovetails with this is, as well as working at the bottom, which we certainly need to do, where there's been a lot of destruction of community organizations, including but not limited to those created by trade union membership. We also, I think, need to work at the top. There is frequently, to my mind, a crisis of vision in our so-called left political leadership, it having become so pickled in Thatcherism and in the 1990s, to the extent I think that there are occasions where they can't see the opportunities for gainful, socially useful state intervention, even when they're stark, staringly obvious. I was talking just the other day within the department about the simple example of a few years ago when the US had to close down one of only 3 baby formula producing plants in the US. We all know that the demand for that baby formula is not going to go anywhere because there are however many infants in need of it at that point in time. But there was no effort to do what would have been done almost automatically by, say, the US military in the 1940s, which, well, obviously then we've got to institute some kind of quantity rationing scheme. Instead, what you got was a litany of TikTok videos from, angry mothers who'd spent all day driving around San Diego failing to find baby formula. So one of the things that concerns me.
Yeah, go ahead. Finish your.
Well, I was just thinking is why does such obvious need for useful state intervention? Why did they not present themselves as obvious? And I think that's something that we need to work on.
I was
Can
going
I just add some? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Mariana, please.
Sorry, just something that Teresa said in terms of UBI. I think it's interesting that it's not just the scheme that's important to figure out what the better scheme is, but the narrative around it. So, the concept of a citizen's share, a citizen's dividend. So getting back part of what you produced, right? Even if it's the same amount of money that gets to you, in the mail. It's very different from something that the tech community, of course, loves, this narrative that they're creating all the wealth, right? They're the value creators, and the state is just going to redistribute that value in a way that everyone out there can get a check in the mail. That doesn't upset the dysfunctional economy that we create, which then has also allowed excess profits, what the classical economists called rents in the system. So it's not surprising that the Silicon Valley bros love UBI, right? Whereas a citizen's share and a citizen's dividend, it's not only a different story, but then requires much more attention to that pre-distribution, getting the capital-labor relationship right, the public-private relationship right. So we socialize not only the risks that everyone's taking, but also the rewards, right? Because if you're seen also as a risk taker, not just a de-risker, a facilitator, a market fixer, but a market maker, of course you need to make sure that we're socializing the rewards, right? So the stories and the narratives are just as important as the underlying economic theories and framings and policies. And it's really great. I think that we're all kind of, in our own way, talking about that.
Hans, you get the last word.
Yeah, and actually this follows on directly from what Mariana just said. So, and also to bring us back to the election a little bit, because I think we're all roughly in agreement about the kind of economy that we want to see. But what strikes me is that Bidenomics, which you and I write about in our paper, was meant to go in that direction. Now, obviously, it wasn't as radical, it wasn't radical enough for people like us, but, it was meant to be a step going in that direction. That was also how it was sold, as I say. And if you think about, say, if I compare it to, say, what the Keir Starmer government is doing in Britain, I mean, Bidenomics is much more radical, right? So for me, the outstanding question that was raised a little bit by the election outcome last night is, is this essentially a sort of substantial failure that Bidenomics didn't go far enough? Or is it a communications failure that they weren't able to sell even what they were doing, right? Because, this struck me all year since I've been in New York that what the Democrats needed to do was persuade voters that the economy was not better under Trump, right? It was worse, it's better under Biden, and it won't be better under Trump if he's re-elected. And spectacularly failed, it seems to me, to even try to make that case in any kind of persuasive way, apart from the fact that, as I say, we would all much, we would want Bidenomics to have gone much further. But they didn't even sell what they had done, it seems to me, very effectively, with precisely these voters who I think have now abandoned the Democrats for Trump.
Thank you, Hans. I'm going to bring the conversation to an end, showing you again the issue from which all of these wonderful speakers have contributed, and thank all of you for participating. There's going to be significant twists on the Democratic front and on the economic front, both domestically in the US and with implications globally. And I hope we can reconvene this group to put their minds to the twists and turns that we see in this relation between economy and democracy. Thanks, everybody, for joining today.